All right. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it just another minute. Thank you for your patience. We did alter the time, so you're not crazy if you logged in at 2. But we wanted to get as much as we could out of this discussion, so we had to adjust the time a little bit. Um, and so we're just giving some last minute folks a chance to hop on. And then we'll get started. So thank you so much for joining. And if you came on at 2, thank you so much for coming back at 2:30. All right. Well, hi there, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm so glad that you all have joined us today. If this is your first COSSA Headlines webinar, let me introduce myself. My name is Wendy Noss, and I'm Executive Director of the Consortium of Social Science Associations. We're a DC-based nonprofit that exists specifically to advocate for the social and behavioral sciences, and that means funding, but it also means policy, and it also means the uptake of our research and the development of policy by policymakers. And so this is our members only, it's been monthly webinar, given all that's been happening around the world, to deliver information that you may be hearing about in the news, but to boil it down to the things that you need to know today, because there is just too much to keep track of. And there are new developments every day, and it's tough for us DC people to keep track of it all, let alone folks who don't do this for a living. So that's what we're doing here today. Hopefully you're here because you belong to one of our member organizations. So COSSA is a coalition of associations or organizations. So these are our member organizations and universities. And what that means is anyone affiliated with any one of these groups can participate in COSSA activities. So you are already a COSSA member, whether you knew it or not. And the best way to get others to participate is by word of mouth. So sharing our information with others in your organizations and making sure that you are signing up for COSSA's members only resources. And our team can throw those links in the chat for you on how to do that, because perhaps you were forwarded a message about today's webinar, but to ensure you get notice of future ones going forward, please feel free to sign up. But today, we're going to do something a little bit different than we've done the last couple of months. So if you've joined us recently, we've been talking about all of the executive orders, what's going on with funding in Congress and tax legislation, and really a sweeping overview of what's happening and how that's changing month to month. But today I figured you were tired of hearing from me, so we invited a special guest to come and talk with us specifically from the perspective of universities and higher education. And so we recognize that our audience here today is broad in terms of sort of your fields of research and interests across the social sciences, but also that we may have active researchers, we may have administrators and deans, we may have students, we may have association professionals. But no doubt the challenges that are confronting higher ed right now are impacting all of us in some way, and some of us more than others, perhaps. So to that end, we have asked our good friend Tobin Smith from the Association of American Universities to come talk with us today. And I left it open for him to talk with us about what the most pressing issue is at this moment, because it might be different from yesterday. And so, Toby, I'm going to unshare and allow you to share your screen.
Great.
And don't want to waste any time. We want to hear everything you have to say.
Okay. I will, there we go. Let's see if this works here. Just need to get it on slideshow. There we go.
Beautiful.
Um, Well, Wendy, thank you for inviting me. I wish it was a more cheery topic to be talking on, but there are many challenges. And I added the research community because, of course, representing AAU, it's not just higher education, but the research community is threatened. And of course, the unique role of AAU is that we represent the leading research universities in the United States and 69 institutions total, a few more publics than privates. But the big research universities are who we represent. And so, what I wanted to do today, just to set some context for where I'm going to go, I want to talk about some of the immediate challenges in the context we're seeing, what we're dealing with, how we're thinking about those challenges, where our priorities are. But I also want to talk about maybe how we got here. And a bigger challenge is how we message about the research we do. Why is it important? What have we learned through some of the polling we've done, and how are we responding to that in terms of our advocacy strategy? So let me get right into it. Let's talk about the national landscape. And again, it sounds like you've had some previous discussions, and I know everybody is very well aware that there have been numerous executive orders issued since Donald Trump took office as the new president. Those have dealt with elimination of DEI programs, extreme vetting of international students, and the list goes on. And we also know our universities, and some in particular, have been attacked for anti-Semitism, for the protests. This goes back to of course, the hearings that were held last year, for which we had university presidents resign as a result. And those hearings have continued into this year. What has been good on that is maybe not so many campus protests, but there have been some. Um, we've seen proposed caps on indirect costs at NIH, DOE, NSF, and while it's not been implemented yet, there is a memo on the streets that there will be a proposed 15% cap at the Department of Defense. And as I say, these times are really unprecedented. Never seen this. I've been doing this now for over 30 years, working for higher ed. Never seen the amount of change that we're seeing in not necessarily a positive way. And what I will say, AAU was founded in 1900. We've never sued the government. We're on our third lawsuit where with DOD, we'll be entering our fourth lawsuit against the federal government in this year. We've seen visa revocations and concern amongst international students, deportations, and even concern about international scientists who are afraid to come here to conferences for fear they won't get in the country, and even some stories about international scientists being turned away at the border. And that raises another question. Increased scrutiny on both the Hill and from the White House. Some of the executive orders have spoken to this, particularly as it relates to China, but also with the anti-Semitism concerns, increased worry about what our relationships are with countries like Qatar. And those have come under scrutiny. And so much so that we've seen campuses like Texas A&M eliminated their campus in Qatar because they were getting so much concern, particularly from their state legislature, about having that relationship. We've seen the proposed elimination of the Department of Education. I will say it is still there. I just came from a meeting at the department, so they haven't torn down the building yet. But there's a lot of questions about what it will mean if it happens. And then we'll get into this more when I talk about budget, but significant proposed federal budget cuts on the order of basically cutting more NSF by more than half and NIH by 40%, and the list goes on. And the cuts that DOGE has made to just the staffing, probationary employees, which really, unfortunately, despite what we've heard that is supposed to be cutting the waste and fat out of government, the employees that I've seen go are the young, new federal employees at places like NIH, the young first, scientists who were really enthused about being a federal worker, and they are the ones we lost. And that means also there's not staff even to answer questions at the agencies. It's been really difficult when some of our institutions haven't been able to draw down funds, and nobody is there to answer their question as to why. So this has been a challenge. So the bottom line, there is a great deal of uncertainty of the future, and that's affecting our institutions in significant ways. For example, we don't know, and many of you have seen this, we don't know how many graduate students we can actually admit as we see grants canceled in the middle, and we have to move graduate students already in the system onto new grants, and their work is upended, as are their advisors. We have seen places like University of Pennsylvania, announce a third reduction in their graduate admissions. We know that's happening across campuses. We've also seen graduate students offers contingent upon available funding. So we're seeing graduate students apply to a lot more places because they're not sure what kind of offers they're going to get. It also makes that difficult because we can't anticipate whether the graduate students who applied will actually accept. So a lot of uncertainty in the system. What are our top issues? Well, always research. I mean, these are the issues we started the beginning of the year with, but the way we're dealing with them have changed. I'll talk about that in a second. But we particularly funding for NIH, NSF, and the other key research agencies. Our ability to compete with China in some of these areas of critical technology like AI, and quantum. But I also am worried, especially with some of the proposed reorganizational plans that have kind of come out about what's happening in NSF, that we're going to lose broad-based support for key disciplines, including, and I'm very worried about social sciences and what's going on in the humanities with the National Endowment for the Humanities. So those are big issues for us. Research policy. We had already been concerned about research security. It's taking a little bit of a back burner, but I mentioned the concern about international students, Chinese students. We continue to deal with that on the Hill. There are bills that are going through, like the Deterrent Act, which we're very concerned about. We had been working on a scientific integrity. We had a workshop. We were doing a lot of work. We still want to revisit that. We know actually, and we've heard Jay Bhattacharya, the new NIH director, talk about the need to ensure reproducibility. We hope to get back to that, but it's been put on hold just because of all the fires we've been putting out with what we've seen. Excellence and transparency. I have to say I'm a little bit worried about, scientific merit review and peer review, and that as a means to judge the quality of science, which is, again, something really came out of World War II as the way we would fund science. But there are proposals afoot to maybe use more geographic distribution or block grants. And we saw that in Project 2025. It was mentioned. I heard some allusions to that, maybe particularly as it relates to NIH. And then impact. We need to do better than ever, and I'll talk about that when we get the message, talking about why the work we do at our universities matters. Not only matters to our faculty, but to the average tax-paying citizen in the United States. Workforce, certainly domestic workforce. How do we ensure that we have the talent base we need? But that's also, and we've relied, and international talent has been tremendously valuable to us historically. And I do worry we are discouraging international talent from coming here. But not only that, I think with some of the reductions in funding, we have a whole list of articles that have been written about the brain drain that's starting. And I know our European colleagues and China and other countries are advertising right now, come to our country to do your science. And they're recruiting U.S. scientists and graduate students to come. Higher education, I mentioned, the anti-Semitism. It's a huge thing, and trying to keep our students safe, fight against anti-Semitism, protect free speech broadly, though, because it's got to be, we've got to do this holistically. And the other thing is, for our universities, one thing that's really important is focusing on the fact that, particularly graduate education, but at other levels, our universities are unique in that they integrate research and education. And that's not well understood, particularly about graduate education, that students, I just met with a graduate in the folks from the National Association of Graduate Professional Students, and we talked about the fact that members of Congress don't understand how we paid and attracted the best talent in graduate education, which is really the apprenticeship model, the model where you're paid off research grants, you actually get your education and do research paid for. That's our system. It's worked well, but I worry about it. And then tax policy. We have this reconciliation bill, a lot of things. We just sent a letter up today because they're in the throes of considering that. The votes will come up. I think they're going to try and bring it to the House floor this week, but there are things like the endowment tax on certain institutions that have endowment sizes proportionate to their student populations above a certain level. We have taxation of changes in student loan programs, and even tax policies toward R&D are being considered. Let me talk about our advocacy efforts. What are we doing? Well, as I said, the things we care about remain the same, but we've been operating really in crisis response mode. The number of things that come out on any given day, the changes that we see, the new executive orders, the new directives from agencies, agency implementation policy. So I tell people, first of all, our presidents and chancellors, I've seen more of them on the Hill than I've ever seen in the 30 years I've been doing this. They're up there regularly. Our board is more active. Our board normally meets quarterly. They're meeting weekly. And we've also created a separate group of presidents that meets on Mondays. The board meets on Tuesdays, that is looking at how we address, both from a comms perspective, communications perspective, and from a government relations perspective, this challenge to the notion that universities are the appropriate entities to fund and support research. And we're also working with, of course, the government relations people on our campuses, the public affairs representatives from our campuses, and other groups like our senior research officers, our vice presidents for research, and other constituency groups. In fact, they came up, and for the first time, we had them go up to the Hill on a lobby day when associated with their meeting. What's our core immediate focus? I already talked about, the research funding cuts are of greatest concern to us. And grant terminations, I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. And then other detrimental EOs. I mentioned the elimination of the Department of Ed and some of the immigration policies that we've seen. And the other is just, how do we message the importance of the research we do in a time when that may not be as well understood as we thought it was? So I'll talk about that. That's going to be at the conclusion. I'm going to get into some of what we're doing there. The funding outlook, many of you are living this, but we're concerned about those future budget cuts proposed in the president's budget. But we're seeing grants canceled, and now I think over 1,700, maybe even more, at just the NSF alone. And that's happened all in the last 4 weeks. The F&A caps I talked about, the agency staffing reductions we've seen because of the cuts by DOGE, and targeting individual institutions. This is something I didn't talk about, but we know that the punishment for things like anti-Semitism, and even we see this with Penn and the transgender athlete that have, the swimmer. Research funds are being used as a punishment for actions outside of research. That concerns us very much, and we're certainly trying to fight against that. And then just as I said, targeting specific disciplines and research topics, including social sciences and humanities. We're very concerned about that and what it means, and seeing whole programs. Like the Minerva program, just canceled at the Department of Defense. We were around when Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, created that program. We know why he did it, and there were good reasons to have social science involved in advising the Defense Department, relating to how we ended up in Iraq, and his thoughts about that whole situation. And that program is now gone. So let's talk about some of the messaging and what we're trying to. These are the same messages I presented to our presidents when they were here about 3 weeks ago. And it's really, first of all, what's at stake? Well, I think we are really concerned that this is at risk is U.S. scientific leadership, and this idea that universities were post-World War II. It was decided, and during World War II, it was decided by the federal government that universities, as opposed to creating a comprehensive national lab network or other mechanisms to do research to serve the American people, that we'd use our universities to do that. Yet we've seen recently statements like it's a privilege to do research on behalf of the government. I don't know. I argue no. Universities, what we do is we fund the best researchers wherever they're at whatever university, and they do that research to serve the national interests of the public. And what do we get from that? I mean, we get new medical advances, we get stronger US national security, we get economic growth, we get a strong US STEM workforce because we train those students as they do research. That's the apprenticeship model that the US system was built on and other countries are trying to copy. And if we don't have that, it will harm our competitiveness. All those things are things we will lose with the proposed budget reductions that we're seeing. So when we talk to the presidents, though, the issue is how to localize this, how to make it, personalize it to people back in your states where your universities are located, in the localities. And that's so important. So we tell them, you've got to focus on what's happening, not only on campus, but what will the people in your state, those taxpayers who are most aligned with your institution, what will they lose? And whether that's cuts, to in clinical trials that are affecting patients. I'll go through this a little bit more in the messaging. Now, I'm going to switch gears because now I'm going to talk more broadly is how did we get here to where we're at? And this goes to something I've been talking about this to graduate students interested in science policy for a long time, observing the growing polarization of the United States by party. And this thing that concerns me, and many of you are probably familiar with this, is called the red-blue map. It didn't exist until I knew, but this didn't really exist until like the 90s. It became popular to look at the red-blue map because what was happening was a regionalization where you could basically look at the map, and if you lived in a rural area, you voted Republican. If you looked in an urban area, you voted Democrat. I mean, the majority of the people. And the suburbs were places where there was actually competition elections. And that has only grown worse. Just to tell you about this cultural divide, I often talk about the work of Dave Wasserman, who worked for the Cook Political Report. Dave has characterized this growing cultural divide by rural urban areas by looking, they've done an analysis where he's looked at where there's a Whole Foods or where there's a Cracker Barrel, in which counties those are located and how people voted in those counties. You go back to 1990, this is where you start to see this growing divide in terms of rural urban and how people vote. The difference between how people voted where there's Cracker Barrel and a Whole Foods was only 19%. But then go to 2012, the election of Barack Obama, that margin was 46%. Then go to the first Donald Trump election, the gap had grown to 54%. And that's what makes that red-blue map. Now, why does this matter? I think it matters. Well, let me talk to you because a little bit more. First of all, if you look geographically, 80 only in the election that the most recent presidential election, Donald Trump, if you look at how a majority of the people in counties voted, 86% of US counties voted for Donald Trump, and only 14% did a majority of people vote for Kamala Harris. Now, what's interesting though, and what's a bit alarming, this was there was a study done by Mark Moreau and a colleague at Brookings Institute that shows that of those 14% of counties that voted for Harris, they account for 62% of the US GDP in terms of economic growth. And that's significant because it does, and I grew up, by the way, I grew up in rural Michigan, and if you know the Michigan speak, I'll hold my hand up in the thumb. But it was very rural, and it's still very rural. And I feel, and economically, it's become much more depressed. You either farmed or you worked like my father did in the auto industry, which, of course, the plant he worked in no longer exists. So I think this divide rural urban that we have to face. Now, the other thing, let's put it in the perspective of, okay, let's look at AAU institutions. I had my staff here help me out. And what we wanted to do was look at, okay, where are the institutions that I represent located? What's most important to know is only 7 are located in those red counties that voted for where a majority of people voted for Donald Trump. A majority of them are located in those 14% of the counties that voted for Harris. That presents a challenge. Just if you're interested in which ones are in those Trump voting counties, you can look, and this is the list. But it creates a challenge for us in that, as we know, a lot of people will say they've never met a living scientist or engineer. Well, the reality is, if they all live in certain geographic areas, they probably haven't. I used to think it was just the scientists and engineers didn't talk much about to their neighbors, which I still think is true, but I also think we have a problem in that there just aren't the scientists and engineers. We do have programs like cooperative extension, which do put people who know research out into localities, but we need to figure out how to reach that other half of the country. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about in terms of our efforts, because what we've seen is a growing anti-elitism in this country and a resentment against our universities. And, that used to be just, oh, those liberal universities, the people, the social scientists, that's a challenge for you in the social science community, is that there is a view that social scientists, humanists are more liberal, and that we're not at our universities promoting enough diversity of thought across the ideological spectrum. I recommend a book to all of you written by Catherine Kramer on the rise of Scott Walker in Wisconsin. Her chapter 4, she is a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, and it's the politics of resentment. And it talks about that resentment that exists in rural areas and how they look in chapter 4 specifically at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and their view of the University of Madison in Wisconsin. And it's instructive in terms of, I think, some of the real challenges we face and why we find ourselves where we're currently at. And we also saw this in the pandemic. And part of it was the way we described science. It got us into some trouble. And in this polarized world that we live in, what does it mean to follow the science? People think science tells you the facts. They don't recognize that it changes and that what we know today may be different than what we know. And this got people confused. They heard Tony Fauci say, you don't need to wear masks. And then 3 months later, the science moved. There was a different view. He said, you need to wear masks. And they're like, what's going on? Like, can we trust this guy? Can we trust science? We also know that with the strong ideological bent being put into areas like climate change, people, it's not that they don't believe in science, but they believe in the science that aligns with their ideology, and they believe the more credible scientist is the one that aligns with what their political views are, not necessarily what the scientific consensus is. So we have to explain how science works. We have to do better with the public, that it's not static, that we don't know everything. We also have to be careful because science is not policy prescriptive. It never gives you the right policy answer. That is a balancing act. And so people who are upset because the health scientists said the best thing is to lock down schools, we probably should have had, there should have been some thought. There's also science that would tell you what the impact of that might be. And we learn after the fact as well. And we are learning about the challenges that posed. And we have a lot of students who are way behind in school because learning at home wasn't necessarily the best thing. What was the best answer? I don't know. These are tough trade-offs from a policy perspective. But I do think a lot of people are blaming science when maybe science isn't exactly the right place to blame. So the last thing I just want to conclude with, just we have to think about how we talk. We do constant polling here at AAU to understand public opinion. I'm going to talk about that in a second. We need to personalize scientific impact. We need to figure out why it matters to individuals, what they care about. As Alan Alda, of course, who's talked a lot about these things, overcome the curse of knowledge. That's not remembering what it's like not to know what you know. And scientists have a big problem with relating their science to average people. Why does it matter to you? Not why does it matter to my scientific colleagues and me, but why does it matter to you? And then we have to do more listening. and understand where people are coming from so we can then start where they're at, not try and pull them along to where we think they should be. Um, I have worked a lot and talked a lot to a woman, Nancy Jackson, who is in the advancement office at the University of Kansas. But for a few years, back in 2010, she left the university and challenged by her then father-in-law to go out and speak to rural members living in rural Kansas about the importance of research and climate change. And she talks about the words she used, how she tapped into those individuals, their moral beliefs, their religious beliefs, and tried to get away from the normal political talk and explain why addressing climate change was important to farmers because of changes in weather, why it mattered and how you could save money through weatherizing your home, things like that. I think it's a lesson because I don't think we do a good job talking to that other half of the country who may not have a university in their backyard. So we need to do a better job. Raphael Reif talked about the importance of universities to the nation in this Boston Globe piece he did. So let me just talk and conclude with what we are doing at AAU. We did polling. We wanted to understand what the American public felt in terms of the outcomes of research, which ones they respected. So health outcomes, no surprise, very high, but they also, support work that advances businesses and creates jobs. And we know that manufacturing does well in polling, advanced manufacturing and work in that. We know that um, that we also linking advances to helping soldiers in the field, and then these other areas we kind of polled, and based upon that, and this is just the Republican Democratic split here. By the way, one of the interesting thing is diagnostics polled high. We often just talk about drugs, but diagnostics, which often came out of disciplines that weren't NIH funded, but instead Department of Energy, NIH. It's important to know that we found that they are particularly high depending on how you word the question. Um, so based upon that, we launched uh, a campaign, digital advertising campaign here in DC that we ran back in the fall that really tried to look at how university research impacted people's lives. And then tapped into that. You see some of these are the diagnostic tools ads that ran. And if you clicked on this, you would then be taken to a web page that talked about a whole bunch of university examples in this particular area of research that was being done, how it was improving how diagnostics were improving people's lives, or how new technologies and advanced manufacturing were moving forward and helping us to address issues like supply chain shortages, things like that we're seeing because we were overly dependent on manufacturing outside of the U.S. Agriculture was a big one, of course, in those rural areas. That's one that polled very high and well. So we did a whole set of work on agricultural research. And then the other areas I talked to you, the soldier, the manufacturing. So we have these pages on our webpage. If you click on the ad, you get to these. I'm just going to conclude, and then I'm going to open it up if we have a little bit of time, maybe for one or two questions. The other was additional strategies that we're taking on. So certainly, I've already mentioned our presidents are up on the hill, but we also know this is a time when actually maybe getting other people to speak on our behalf. We worked very hard to get defense leaders to support the work and explain that the work of the National Science Foundation underpins our national security. That foundational knowledge has led to things that are critical to the Department of Defense and to other areas of security, but as well as competitiveness. Industry leaders know that the people they rely on to come and work for them are trained at our universities. We're turning to alumni, trying to engage graduate students and undergrads in ways, and on the health side, some of our best advocates are the patient groups who benefited from the research done at our university. So we're working very closely with them. The bottom line is we've got to figure out how to promote research universities as the tools by which research that it benefits and advances national goals is done, and that's why they're in the national interest. So to attack universities, to cut the funding for research won't just hurt our faculty and our students, it will hurt the interests of the American people. It will help, it won't help make America great in the future. And if we want that, we have to make that case and do it better than we have in the past. So with that, I will conclude.
Toby, thank you so much. I'm impressed how much you got through in such a short amount of time, although
Yep.
I'm probably saying these points in your sleep at this point.
It's interesting because I've given that talk, the talk about and I often go into more detail about the polarization. I've been giving that to graduate students. Only recently I've been talking to groups like this a little bit more broadly. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but then to see it play out the way it has played out this year and the detrimental impact of
Yeah,
that divisiveness and how it's been turned against universities and the work we do
yeah.
and the kind of that resentment I talked about and knowing about it because I mean I go back home and people I say I work for universities and I will have one person say, "Oh, you're a lib." You know, a libtard. That's what I was told at my class
Mhm.
reunion, right? You're one of those libtards. So, that bothers me because I don't think that's positive for the country. And we need to work on how we relate to people who feel like um, they're not listened to by
Mhm.
by folks at our universities sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really starting to hit home for all of us, I think, even though, like you said, a lot of this has been in the polling for a long time,
Yep.
but man, they just needed the opportunity for
Yep.
the wildfire to spread, and here we are. Folks, please do raise questions. There's a little bit of chatter going on in the chat box, so I'll mention those in a second. I wanted to ask Toby, to the point of, we don't do a good, we science doesn't do a good job of communicating with non-science audiences. We know that. Now we're seeing, especially within the context of cuts to agencies and terminations of not only grants, but positions and staff, we're seeing politicians just this week during HHS hearings. We're hearing senators say that researchers are stealing from the NIH. Just flat out lies, misrepresentations
Right.
of what's happening. And so, we've always had, I think, attacks from critics in Congress in the past, but it seems like we're at such a different level now where the folks who are representing these rural communities or other communities that we've missed over the years, they have the ear of their local constituents, and they're saying things that are just blatantly untrue. Do you see a role for the research community in combating that? Or do you think it's
Well,
dangerous to engage in the political fray in that way, if that makes sense?
I see a role, but we know that things like misinformation research are being attacked, right?
Yeah,
So that's a challenge in of itself. And one
right.
of the challenges, I mean, if you look historically, one of the reasons prior to World War II, universities were very hesitant to take federal money. They were hesitant to take federal money because if they became reliant on the federal government could then tell them what to do research on and what not to. That didn't come true for a long time, but maybe we're starting to see that concern now come to fruition. Um, so immediately there's going to have to be rethought about how we do research and support research if government funding goes away. That is not an easy thing because I'm not sure industry is going to step in and step up. I'm not sure there's the philanthropic money that existed, you know, pre-depression, like from the Rockefellers and the Mellons and the Carnegies of the time that supported a lot of research at universities. And the magnitude of the work that we do is so much larger. But the universe that I think what I'd say is there a role? Absolutely. And part of that role is getting better at communicating the value of what we do, why it's important, why basic research that doesn't have a purpose, the results, and as Jim Cooper talked about, former congressman from Tennessee, the The scientific community needs to get better at storytelling. And let's tell truthful stories, but good ones. We don't have to lie to get what we need, but we have to do better at storytelling and explaining how research has impacted people's lives. The fact that we wouldn't have the system for kidney transplantation, the daisy chain, that without the work of Professor Roth, and economics work,
Yeah.
and telling that story in a way that people can relate to. And so I think there's a lot of work and that's partially how we train students and engage from the beginning.
Hmm.
So I think there is a role. I think we have no choice but to try and do better at that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. A couple of things in the chat. There was a little bit of discussion about that came up when you were talking specifically about rural outreach and the divide there. And so, what do you think about including rural urban equity into our DEI language and goals?
I'd like to say I believe personally that's important. I would be very careful because health equity programs are being cut. The lack of specificity around the words that are being chosen to cut grants, the fact that we know that some of the programs like biodiversity programs have been cut. Why? Because diversity was part of bio, not because, and not even had to fight to get that funding back for grants that were cut just because the word was used. So the word equity is just a problem right now. And I'm not saying it should be. I totally disagree with that. And we have to fight. But I also think we also have to figure out how to talk about things differently. Let me say something about the rural urban split. I believe our values actually are not that different between the people that I mentioned back home. But how we refer to them in the language we use, it's like I often talk about my life in cross-cultural communications. We need to speak a different language that relates to people who don't live where we do or who have different political views. I don't believe people have different values. I believe we share the same values. We want the same things. And if we can relate better, I think we'll do better.
Hmm, that's a really good point. Let's see. Changing gears, we have a question. I'm curious what arguments are effective with lawmakers to counter the endowment tax proposal. My understanding is that the tax will adversely impact access and research. Is that the message?
I mean, that's certainly our message is that, first of all, endowments are not slush funds like many members of Congress think. They look large, but it is off the earnings of those endowments. Many of them are restricted, but a majority of that money goes to scholarships, to financial aid, and to support the research that we do on our campuses, endowed chairs, right? So it's actually in helping to do that. And for every dollar in grant aid that the federal government gives, I can tell you our universities at AAU, we put in $5 of aid to match that dollar of government aid. That is not well understood. Where does that come from? The endowment funds. But that is a message that it's unfortunately we're in this endowments become a way to pick on the big elite Ivy League schools because they're the ones who have those endowments, and that's partially the challenge we face is logic and rationality is not going to win the day. And so I'm resigned. We will see an increase in the endowment tax. We have the increases that have been proposed in the bill that's being considered in the House as we speak are significant. I'm hopeful that we won't end up with those amounts by working with the Senate, but it's going to be a tough row to hoe here. And endowment tax, unfortunately, is likely to go up and have more institutions covered by it.
Mm-hmm. We have
Um,
another question. Oh, did you have something else?
no, go ahead.
Okay, there was one other question in the chat, and folks, please do raise your hand if you have anything else you want to raise. A question about IES at
Yes,
Department of Ed, which just has me wondering about IES, but there are so many smaller agencies, NEH and IMLS, and so many that because everything is under attack,
right.
some things are going to disappear and no one will notice, I'm being, you know, But curious, I guess, with respect to this question and AAU's priority on IES and data, lost data,
Right.
that sort of thing.
Well, remember, we utilize iPads. It's critical to us. So we're horrified about the prospect of losing the iPads data. We're worried about NCSES at NSF, but I think they're in a little better position. But I mean, with the attacks on these type of programs, and as I said, social science programs and educational programs like IES, and we're part of the IES coalition. We're very aware and of the things we care about when it comes to research at Department of Ed. I mean, very concerned about the what will be the future of IES. And the basically it's gutting right now. So how we deal with it, the problem is when you have so many different fires you're fighting, where do you put your emphasis and how do you deal with that? And that's part of the strategy here is I think this administration, because they believe that the government has gotten too large, they are and with the efforts of DOGE to go in and do this quickly before people who might have different opinions, like the people who are nominated to serve in key positions, or even when there are those people, they come in and overrule them. I think it's going to be a challenge. So we're very concerned about IES. That doesn't mean at the end of the day we'll be successful. I mean, we're going to see cuts across the board in research. If we can hold the Congress to try and defend some of these, that's also the other place is people need to be making their voices heard. But when they do that, when you talk to members of Congress, don't just think about, oh, this woe is me. I lost my job or I'm losing my graduate students. You've got to put this in the context of why it matters beyond the individual campus. Why does that research that won't get done matter beyond what happens to faculty, what happens to students? And it's always a challenge, but I think it's really important we do the best job we can.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you said that. It validates something that we've been saying, that talking about impacts in very different ways than what we're used to in the research community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know how many press releases I like press responses or statements I've gone and I've added to the, reduction in students to the impacts, and it will have significant impacts on national goals like national security, health, that will adversely affect U.S. taxpayers.
Right, right. This environment has really changed the playbook for all of us to we would there for those of you, who don't live in this world every day, there are things that advocates do every year, like clockwork, submit testimony and go to
Yep,
the Hill and have meetings and submit questions for hearings and things. And this has blown up even our playbook that
correct.
having to significantly change our written
Well,
testimony for the first time in decades, right?
and I think, and we are launching beyond building on the brand perception campaign, we are going to put some significant amount of resources into uh, a broader advertising campaign
Hmm.
that will really focus on if you want kind of what I said, if you want America to be great, science has got to be a part of that. And that's
Mhm.
broad-based science. It's science underpinning science. So to ensure that the US wins, and I see the question about China. China, when we poll, has less of an impact with the American people, but it is a hot button issue in Congress. And so certainly suggesting and using China, who I believe has looked at the US and is copying our playbook. They're investing heavily in research universities, investing heavily in attracting, and sometimes even in ways that we feel are problematic in recruiting talent to China or trying to use talent abroad to advance China's interests. And that's why we get beat up on research security. I think it's critical that we really focus on that and why we need, and if the US is going to continue to be a global leader, we can't do it without investing in science.
Yeah, to that point, you may have participated yesterday. There was a press conference with Senate Democrats specifically on cuts to NSF.
Yes.
Um, and I'm putting in the chat, they did record it for YouTube, so you can watch that there. And it was great to have that amount of attention on NSF. It doesn't often get that from policymakers. And to have the folks who were there, former NSF director, former OSTP director, those who have benefited from undergraduate research programs and graduate programs as well, all talking about the value. It was all great. One thing I think I'll leave you with, Toby, is an offer that very little was talked about social and behavioral
Yeah.
science and the human-centered approach that needs to be taken with a lot of this. There was lots of talk about China, lots of talk about engineering. They said, without NSF, we wouldn't have Tesla, we wouldn't have GPS, we wouldn't have cell phones. Um, and we're part of that. But we need to do a better job, our community of articulating our value. But we so appreciate the work that AAU does, and these ads have been amazing. If you need anything from our community to help with that discussion, please do reach out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Toby.
And I, of course, am a big and think, and especially particularly having overseen our our undergraduate STEM education research initiative, where the very education research, which I've had to try and convince faculty that there is research about education, and you can do a lot better job if you apply the research. So I know the value of the research and the way it can be used to improve people's lives, people's education, but all sorts of other things. And we talked about the national defense implications of not understanding, uh, people, or understanding what a new technology might mean and
Mhm.
how people's behavior will change as a result of it. And you think it's going to do one thing, but that's where social scientists. And the other thing I'll just say about I'm about we are slated to hire a postdoc in economics or science of science policy because I need economists and I need social scientists who are more willing to put their heads down and do applied research on what are the returns on investments in basic research? What
Mm,
do we get from social science research, for example? What is the value? Why is open science more valuable than closed science?
mm.
We have no data on that, and yet I'm getting just beaten up. You should classify all the research because,
Right.
my gosh, we don't want the Chinese to have access to it, even though in areas like AI, they are publishing more in top-rated public journals in AI than we are.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of social science questions where some work. I'll tell you another one right now. This came up just in a speech that the science advisor made the other day. We need more graduate students, domestic born graduate students entering into critical and emerging fields. My argument is, but I have no data, is the opportunity cost to pursue graduate education in STEM right now compared to what an engineer out of one of my schools can go make at Amazon or Microsoft or one of the other high tech companies is too great for them to pursue a graduate degree. I don't see students lining up who got an engineering degree to want to go to grad school and being, as we're told, shut out by international talent. I see international talent being the ones to take those PhD positions, but I have
Mm.
no data to show that. Those are the things we're gonna try and challenge the community to help do the research that helps us make the case in a better way. And the social science community and the economics community, they're going to be critical to that in ways that we haven't. And that applied research that can help us is going to be important.
Thank you so much for that. And thanks for joining us. I'm
Yep.
gonna transition to just a couple of slides on what you can all do. from home. Toby, you're welcome to stay, but if not, thank you so very much
Okay, yeah,
for
I'm going to
talking
sign
with
off,
us.
but thank you. And please, I will be in touch if you can help us, and I know you'll do the same. So
Absolutely.
appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody.
Thanks for everything you're doing.
Yep. Bye-bye now.
All right, gang. So you're probably thinking, well, that's a lot. I'm still depressed, but I want to do something. And so we are constantly refreshing materials, analysis, strategies for things that the social and behavioral science community can do to lend their voice to what's going on. So there are five things I think that we can all do. One is to stay informed. There's so much wonkiness that we just talked about. Some of it may have gone over your head. But if there was any point for you to start to dive into some of the wonky details, this is that time. Our advice is to try to stay calm, but to learn what is real. Don't listen to social media. Find the sources that you trust that are validated that you can go to get the real information. And there's a couple on the screen here that I suggest. Federal Register is very important. You can subscribe to get updates on anything new coming out of every single federal agency. It's required by the federal government if they want to put out something. The Congressional Research Service puts out really easy to explain because they're written for members of Congress, if I could be snide for a second, really easy to understand primers on all types of things, including what is reconciliation? What does that actually mean? So that's a very helpful site. We've partnered with Sage on a tracker where we're posting everything and anything we can find related to executive orders and funding and just the turmoil right now, including a chronology of things that have been happening. So check that out. And there are lots of free trackers out there on the legal aspects of what's going on. The New York Times has done a good job of developing a free tracker of the various lawsuits. And I know that there are others as well. The second thing you can do is to tell your story. There's no shortage of portals out there right now where you can answer some questions, tell an organization how the executive orders or the firings or the grant terminations, how those are affecting you. And we have one as well on our website. And it could be really anything from I'm a graduate student and I lost my position to my grant was terminated to I'm a federal employee and I was laid off. This can be confidential, but these stories we are hearing time and time again. This is what members of Congress want to hear. They don't need the data necessarily, that's helpful, but they want to know the real world impacts and they want to know it for folks who are living in their districts. So we will use these stories without attribution. We won't use anybody's names, but these really help us do our work to explain the full consequence of what's happening. The third thing you can do is to support your professional association. We know that your associations, whether you're part of APA or ASA or linguistics or economics, your associations are working overtime right now. And we don't all have the answers, but we're trying to, figure out the best path forward. They're collecting stories like I just showed, developing policy briefs. The main point here is if your professional association is asking you to take action on something, do it. Take action. And it could be a COSSA action alert that they forwarded to you that makes it easy for you to send off a letter to your members of Congress. Do that. But really, professional associations are doing everyone a service by increasing their workload to find opportunities for you to weigh in. These types of actions, letters to Congress, phone calls to Congress, attending town halls, they're making a big difference. And grassroots is really where I think we're going to see movement in an environment like this. The final thing is just to engage others. That could mean anything. Just forming a group of others who have been impacted in your institution and figuring out what you can do, going to a town hall meeting, volunteering with your professional association, attending a webinar like this, telling others about webinars like this, so we can continue to spread the word. There are so many free resources out there you can do to, as Toby described, tell our story differently. On the COSSA website, we have Why Social Science pieces, which talks about why our science is important to national security and natural resources and education and pretty much every aspect of human life. And we have data points that you can use as well. We're at a point where we're going to throw everything we can at policymakers. Some offices will respond to anecdotes and stories. Some will respond more to dollars and cents. So you'll find a lot of this information on the COSSA website and in other places, but use it all, because I think then we have a best chance of turning the tide a little bit. Thank you so much for sticking around a couple of extra minutes. Hopefully you are already receiving the COSSA newsletter every other week on Tuesdays. It'll go out next Tuesday in our latest edition. So if you're not subscribed, go to COSSA.org and you can subscribe to that. It's free, and that is where we put in everything you might need to know that's going on in DC for social science that over the last couple of weeks. And then we have our members only messages, which I know Elise has already put in the chat. And that is an extra level of analysis and content that is for our members only, including action alerts. And of course, feel free to follow us on social. So we're out of time, but thank you all again so much. We will be back next month, topic TBD, because every day is TBD at this point. But if you are making sure to sign up for our resources directly, you'll hear from us soon once we set the date. So thank you again. Hang in there, and please do reach out if we can be helpful at all to your efforts.